For many years, across the channel, we've been exploring unusual disappearances from all over the world, and in that time, we've covered cases from many countries from every continent. This video is going to be a compilation of some of the more unusual and unexplained cases that I covered around 4 to 5 years ago. We'll be back to normal next week, as I've almost finished writing about a double disappearance that I think you'll find interesting. In any case, do let me know in the comments if there are any disappearances or topics that you'd like me to cover in the future. With that being said, let's begin. In October of 2019, 47-year-old Adrienne Quintal travelled from her home in Warren to a family cabin in Honor, Michigan. This is a pretty remote cabin, approximately 255 miles northwest of Detroit and 20 miles southwest of Traverse City. Now, something unusual and untoward appeared to have happened to Adrienne on the 17th of October at 2:45 am. 7ABC WXYZ News reported this. Around 2:45 am, Adrienne called a third party in Warren asking for help, police say. The third party then contacted the sheriff's office. Deputies and Michigan State Police arrived on scene at 2:58 am and saw evidence of possible foul play, but were unable to find Adrienne. The sheriff's office and MSP troopers conducted a canine track and ground search of the area with no success. Police say Adrienne left behind her personal property, including her vehicle, cell phone and purse. Adrienne has not been heard from since the 17th of October. Now, a couple of things there. Firstly, the contents of the call with the third party wasn't disclosed here, so it's not clear at this stage what she was requesting help for. Some articles state that the call was frantic, perhaps indicating fear. Secondly, I'm not sure why she didn't just call the authorities directly if she was fearful or suspicious of something. And lastly, while potential foul play was referenced in the article, the authorities later determined that this isn't the case, but we're not quite there yet. The next article I came across was by Fox 2 Detroit, who provided some more information. A family member said, "We had state police and the dog searching all through that morning. The next day, we had a search party come out. My family and I also did a search as well. We've covered most of the ground and haven't found her yet." Just for some further information, this cabin was owned by the family and Adrienne was doing some work on it at the time. She'd also frequented this cabin since she was a child, so we know for certain that she was familiar with the general area. Initially, Adrienne was with her boyfriend at the cabin, but he came home a couple of days before the phone call. It's also important to note that while the authorities at this point did suspect foul play, one discrepancy was that none of the valuable belongings had been taken from the cabin. Or rather, it's not a discrepancy, but it does highlight that the authorities presumed at this stage that the motive must have been personal rather than financial gain in terms of robbery. What's interesting here is that some of the articles mentioned that because they'd been conducting extensive ground searches all around the area with many people and dogs, that if she was still in the area, then she should have been found by now. So with the evidence of possible foul play and the lack of any findings to indicate what may have happened or where she might have gone, I would imagine that behind the scenes, the authorities were contemplating the idea that perhaps she'd been taken out of the area. It also seems that the search area was extended a bit, and they started to scour the swampy areas around the Little Platte Lake and the thick nearby woods too. But as you might imagine, they weren't finding anything, despite the additional dogs brought in and the many drones. I found this quite interesting, basically confirming that the authorities were in fact contemplating that she may no longer have been there. Sheriff Ted Shendell called her boyfriend a subject of interest and have said investigators have talked with him and family. Shendell said no one is in custody or being held in the case. Shendell said authorities conducted an exhaustive search in the immediate area with dogs and an aerial drone but weren't able to locate Adrienne. Shendell said that he didn't know why Adrienne didn't call 911. He said her friend was the last person to hear from her. Shendell said authorities are trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. He continued, "We don't believe that she's here anymore," adding that other agencies are looking for her downstate. I point this out for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's interesting that they couldn't locate her phone immediately, probably thinking it was on her person. However, we'll learn otherwise shortly. Secondly, the sheriff said that the boyfriend was a person of interest. However, they couldn't find any evidence to suggest that he had anything to do with it. Now, because he travelled back home 2 days before the phone call, you've got to imagine he must have had a trustworthy alibi while the call was occurring. Of course, it's absolutely possible that one could return in secret, but it seems that the authorities couldn't find anything to indicate that. For instance, GPS data on the phone can't have indicated that it went back, etc. Just things like that. Right, let's learn more about this phone call Adrienne made on the night she went missing. A woman who went missing from her family's cabin in northern Michigan in October had phoned a friend the day she disappeared, describing a dramatic exchange of projectiles with 2 men. The friend called police but had given authorities an incorrect address for Adrienne's family cabin. By the time police arrived at the right address, some 40 minutes later, they found holes in the cabin's windows and one in the ceiling, but no one inside. During that call, which police said lasted less than 5 minutes, Adrienne said that she hit one of the men and the other was returning fire. Police said officers observed multiple holes in the window and ceiling of the cabin, and they searched the area around the cabin for any injured persons or evidence of injured persons. Officers set up a perimeter around the residence and requested additional police officers to the scene. Authorities forced their way inside the cabin but found it empty. I found that detail quite interesting because when you think about the logistics of the situation, at first glance it perhaps suggests that either Adrienne had the time to lock the door or it was locked by a third party after the fact. Also of note is the fact that they found the arm that she was using on the ground outside, but they found no evidence of any injuries. There was no evidence that anyone had bled or anything of that nature, indicating that all projectiles had missed. I will note that in the phone call, Adrienne believed that she had struck someone. To further compound the confusion, all of the firing had been done from inside the home. I'm sure you can see why I was interested in covering Adrienne's disappearance. In some ways, this aspect resembles the disappearance of David Horsey and Frederick Hardesty, where a similar finding was made. I'll leave a link to that now in the top right corner and in the description if you wish to open a new tab. The question then becomes, given that there was no evidence of a third party at the scene, who was she firing at? Another good question might be, why and in what manner did she leave the cabin, drop her arm on the ground and then lock the door? It seems like it might have been a better idea to have stayed inside the cabin, unless of course she thought that these people had managed to make their way inside with her. At first glance, it's an odd situation, and I can see why the authorities were having a tough time trying to piece it together. There's further information on this that I'm going to get into in a moment. First, just before this gets even weirder, here are a couple of interesting quotes from the sheriff and from the family too. "We're very puzzled by this case. I've been doing this for 39 years and there's just a lot of things going on that just doesn't make sense," said Sheriff Ted Chandel. Her sister said it was terrifying. She must have been terrified in order to fire. She heard noises outside and whatever it was frightened her enough to make a phone call to a friend, and that's how it started. Right, now if we haven't already, let's get bizarre. I've spoken about how the arm she was using was found on the ground. Well, her boots and her phone were found on the roof of the cabin. It's difficult to really know where to go with this one, but there are a couple of possibilities. Firstly, I think most will probably be in agreement that this whole situation reeks of a perceived fear, which led to a panic. Did she leave through the door to lock it? She then dropped her arm on the ground, took her boots off and threw them on the roof with her phone? That seems highly unlikely. Or the fact that the door was locked, it's possible, perhaps likely even in that case, that she might have left through another window and climbed onto the roof. Now why she then proceeded to take her boots off on the roof, I've no idea. I'm struggling to paint a picture in my head of what happened and in what order. I can't understand why you'd take your boots off on the roof of the cabin. You could reason that it's easy to drop the phone in a panic, but you can't exactly drop the boots you're wearing. So the question instead turns into, did she or someone else throw them back onto the roof? I can see why someone else might do that to stop a person from moving or getting away very efficiently, so she probably didn't just throw them up there. However, what is perhaps more likely is that it is possible that she wasn't wearing the boots, but from the window managed to throw them up onto the roof where she planned to climb up and put them on. It looks like in that case that she was successful in getting up onto the roof because the phone was found there too, so why didn't she put the boots on? Because she also must have come back down because again, the arm she was carrying was found on the ground outside, and she was nowhere to be found. I'm not sure there's a great interpretation to be had here that makes total sense. As the authorities seem to indicate, it didn't even look like there was a third party at the scene because there was no evidence of anything other than the hulls her arm had discharged through the window and ceiling. Thus, the reasoning looks to have been that it was suspected that she'd then ran into the thick woods, leaving everything behind. Just some other details here. Adrienne had a dog at the cabin with her who was locked inside the entire time, completely uninjured, and was discovered upon the arrival of the authorities. At this point in the reporting now, she'd been missing for around 5 weeks, and obviously all searches of the area had failed despite them being extensive and frequent, with the use of thermal imaging technology and dogs. The authorities held several hypotheses at this stage too. That she may have been taken by a third party, or had taken some kind of medication or some other problem that caused her to believe that there was a threat nearby, which then caused her to flee into the woods and then the swamp area. The idea that she was taken looks to have been in jeopardy because, and I quote, "Authorities said that they haven't located any evidence consistent with people being at the cabin, and they checked hospitals to see whether there were any people with wounds consistent with what Adrienne told her friend took place at the cabin." Right, Adrienne's body was found 2 months after she disappeared. Some sources state 800 yards, while most state that her body was found between 300 to 400 yards away from the cabin in a swampy area. All state that she was submerged in about 3 feet of water. That swampy section had been an area of interest for K9 teams searching earlier this month, but it had been almost impossible to reach, police said this week. It was a surprising end, so unexpectedly close to the spot where she disappeared, after such a long, involved search process that had generated much attention. That statement makes you wonder if the dogs had found a scent in the area, though it wasn't specifically stated. Unfortunately, the rules on YouTube feel like they're not completely clear and make it somewhat difficult to explain this next part. In February of 2020, the medical examiner detailed that 2 substances were found in her body. This one, which is on the screen now, and medication that was used to combat anxiety. The examiner also noted that exposure to cold weather was also a factor that contributed to Adrienne passing away. Now, the substance that she took can induce a state of psychosis that is often associated with paranoia, delusions, hallucinations, and unpredictable behaviour. So the rather obvious conclusions for the authorities were that she'd taken this, started to experience paranoia, thought someone was after her, and then ran into the woods, where she then succumbed to the elements. It seems somewhat difficult to argue with the official line of thought given the substances found. I've seen some people who seem to be confused as to why her boots and phone were on the roof, and yeah, that is pretty difficult to understand. But if unpredictable behaviour is a symptom or side effect of taking this particular substance, then I suppose that could account for that, either throwing them up onto the roof or taking them off on the roof. Though when these substances are involved, it's difficult to even really guess what someone might have been thinking, so it's difficult to comment. Though I will say, of course, I don't actually know what happened here, and something completely different could have happened. Now, let's move on to the next set of disappearances. In northern central Colorado lies the Rocky Mountain National Park. This is a wilderness that encompasses over 415 square miles of mountainous terrain and attracts over 3 million people every year. While most people enjoy their time at the park and come and go without issue, this isn't the case for everyone. It was a misty morning on the Rockies on the 15th of August 1933. This was the day that Joe Halpern, 22 years old, an intelligent and highly thought of Chicago graduate, would disappear in this national park. Early that morning, Joe and an old friend of his, Sam Garrick, would arrive at the Rockies in his Ford sedan. As he drove through the mist, their destination was clear, the Bear Lake Trailhead. This is where the car would later be discovered, untouched and without its owner. He and Sam began their hike to the flat top mountain, but unlike every single visitor that day, Joe would never come home. This trip to the Rocky Mountains was a small part of a bigger journey. Joe and Sam had been on a western road trip with Joe's parents, starting in Chicago and travelling through South Dakota and ending at the Rocky Mountains. While in the Rockies, the group split into two pairs. Joe's parents wanted to do some light hiking, while Joe was in the mood for something a bit harder. After Joe and Sam had ascended Flat Top Mountain, Sam was finished and was too tired to continue on. Joe, however, wasn't done yet and wanted to head towards Taylor Peak. It was 2:30 PM now, and they made plans to meet back at the Bear Lake trailhead, so off they went on their separate ways. Sam reached the trailhead at around 6:30 PM that day and waited for Joe to return. He waited until 9:30 PM before panic set in and the realization that something might be wrong here. He made his way to a ranger station and a search was put together not long afterwards. It's not clear how many rangers were involved, but a group of them, equipped with electric lights, began to look for any sign of Joe in the direction he took from Flat Top Mountain. Not long after the search began, the area was hit with rain and windstorms, which persisted for some time, though some days were better than the others. After the 6 day of searching came to an end, the Rocky Mountain National Park Service put an end to the search, only stating that all searchers had failed to provide a single clue as to where he could have gone. They found no trace of this man, as if he'd managed to disappear into thin air. Joe's father was never able to let his son's disappearance go, and he had repeated correspondence with the FBI. The family's hope seemed to have been kept alive by rumours and reported sightings of Joe around the country, but none of them were ever confirmed. Later members of the family had another go at trying to understand what happened from 1998 onwards for a time, but it seems it was too late. After Ronald's father, Bernard Halpern, passed away in 1998, Ronald started finding photos tucked into books or letters about Joe haphazardly filed among Bernard's belongings. My father was very stoic. We never really heard a lot about Joe. The only thing we would ever hear is, "Don't go hiking alone, because that's what happened to my brother and he disappeared." Ronald was born almost 20 years after Joe went missing in the Rocky Mountain National Park and never knew the circumstances. But since 1998, he's undertaken an investigation into this family mystery, wrangling every piece of information his father kept about Joe, and even tracking down letters Joe had written back in the early 1930s. He also found letters that show his father, Bernard, quietly kept searching for his little brother. Decades later, he was still writing pleas to the National Park Service and then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Really, I'm just trying to find closure for my father. When I started reading through some of the letters he sent, you could see the passion, the frustration. He really wanted to solve this case for my grandparents before they passed away, and he wasn't able to do that. Unfortunately, unlike the other Halperns before him, Roland was never able to find out what happened to Joe. In fact, it has never been understood what happened to him. Joe disappeared into thin air on that misty day, and despite 88 years passing since that time, not a trace of him has ever been discovered. It seems that whatever took place on that day will remain lost to history. On the 9th of October 1949, two students known as Bruce Gerling and David Devitt disappeared in the Rocky Mountains National Park. Similar to Joe, something also seems to have gone awry around the Bear Lake area. A search was started Tuesday the 11th for two Colorado A&M college students missing on a mountain hike since Sunday. Searchers from the college and Rocky Mountain National Park combed the Bear Lake area near Estes Park for the pair. The students went on an outing with 40 members of the Aggies Hiking Club Sunday. 11 of the party drove to Grand Lake to hike to Bear Lake from the west. At the Grand Lake, Bruce and David were with 9 other members of the group, and while the other 9 continued on their way to Bear Lake to meet with the rest, Bruce and David stopped at a shelter cabin. The pair were unfortunately not realised as missing until the day afterwards, when the rest of the group returned to campus. Interestingly, the hikers did say that on their hike they were hit by a snowstorm, but felt that the missing pair would be okay through it because they were both warmly clothed and had food with them. The park rangers immediately headed to the cabin that Bruce and David had stopped at. But upon arrival, they quickly noted that there was no sign of them inside nor anywhere in the immediate surroundings of the cabin. It was then realised that they may have had an issue of some magnitude on their hands now. Because they had been reported missing late, it meant that they had now spent 3 nights in freezing cold temperatures, and this is when Army mountaineers were called in. Army mountaineers and trained alpinists were called into the search Wednesday for 2 students missing among the icy crags of the Continental Divide. Rocky Mountain National Park officials had little hope the pair would be found alive after 3 nights of sub-zero weather and howling winds which froze hands and feet of the searchers. To make matters worse, when they were initially reported missing late on Monday, the rangers said that the call couldn't have come at a worse time because a heavy snowstorm had closed in on the area. Interestingly, Bruce and David had seen the rest of the group set off, so they certainly knew which direction they were supposed to travel. It was also stated that the trail from the Grand Lake to Bear Lake was clear and shouldn't have been something that was easily strayed away from. With that, the search headquarters was set up at Bear Lake, and many searchers fanned out, travelling back towards the Grand Lake. As I'm sure you can imagine, this search wasn't working, and what was quite surprising to the search group was that they weren't finding anything at all. There were no signs of their presence, and the searchers really had no idea where they were, or where they could even have gone to. No trace of the 2 was found, and Wednesday, a call for help was sent to Camp Carson, Army Training Center at Colorado Springs. An officer and 14 picked men from the 14th Regimental Combat Team were dispatched to the scene. University of Colorado Mountain Rescue Specialists offered their services, but Professor Charles Hutchinson was asked by rangers to stand by to replace tiring men in the 5 groups working Wednesday morning. Among the 5 search groups, 2 of them were sent from Bear Lake to cover the other trails to the Grand Lake. Another group headed for Tyndall Glacier at the base of Flat Top. Another along a canyon north of the mountain towards the A&M's Mountain Club, which Bruce and David were hoping to be pledged to. None of the groups found anything. As the search was drawing to a close that day, some members were not ready to call it off just yet. A specially trained group of mountain troopers, forest rangers, and 5 Colorado A&M students who refused to give up set out to retrack the Bear Lake area in search for the 2 Aggie students. The 2 missing students became separated from a college hiking group and became lost in the rugged, heavily wooded area near the lake, which has been subject to deep snow and freezing temperatures. Just to clarify, the majority of those searching at this point did in fact believe that they were looking for bodies. There weren't many that actually believed that they could have held out for this time. Chief Forest Ranger Barton Herschler, who is directing the intensive search, said the area where the students are lost is so dense that it might be necessary to search and research the same trails and paths several times. The 5 students, last of some 50 college hikers who participated in the fruitless search, were to go over the immediate Bear Lake area again today. The climbing is so rugged that the other classmates of the 2 missing students had to drop out and rest. The following day, we get some interesting reports and statements made by Chief Ranger Barton Herschler. An intensive search of the 12,300-foot flat-top mountain has failed to reveal any trace of Bruce and David. We are just groping. We've been over all the trails twice from end to end. We've gone over every conceivable path they might have taken. High winds Sunday night, Monday and Tuesday have piled 4 and 5 foot snowdrifts in crevices and between rocks. If anyone fell in any of those places, we wouldn't know, Herschler said. To this day, Bruce and David have never been found, so that might suggest it was unlikely that they'd fallen in the crevices, because you'd like to think that they'd have been discovered by now. That is, of course, presuming that they didn't fall into a place that was borderline undiscoverable. Aside from that, given that Barton said that all of the trails had been searched twice from top to bottom, one question that might need poking at is, did they leave the trail, and why would they do that? There can only really be three scenarios here. Either this was a total accident and they'd lost the trail. Earlier comments made by others perhaps suggest that this is unlikely because it was stated that the trail was clear. If they hadn't simply gotten lost, is it possible that they could have encountered an animal which they were wary of and tried to stray away from it, becoming lost? It's important to say that there was absolutely no evidence at all found of animal predation, so this is unlikely. Unless they were pushed from the trail, got lost, and the animal lost interest too. Or they may have come across another person or group that they were unsure of and again were non-physically pushed from the trail in an effort to leave. Again, this is speculation land because there is no evidence of third-party involvement. Nothing resembling a struggle or anything like that was ever found. I'm not really sure what else would cause them to stray from the trail. I suppose one final scenario might be that something in the forest piqued their interest, and they then got lost while investigating. It's not at all clear what happened to them. The search was suspended on the 17th of October that year, with the Tucson Daily Citizen reporting this. The search for two Colorado students lost for 8 days in the snowy heights of the Rocky Mountain National Park has been abandoned. The organised search effort was dropped after a conference between Colorado A&M officials, parents of the boys, park rangers, an Army search detachment from Camp Carson, and members of the school hiking club. Dean of Students J.C. Clevenger said a further search would not be worthwhile. Hope of finding the two students alive is no longer held. Bruce's father, William Gerling, had an understandably difficult time in letting go and accepting this situation. He continued searching alone and with a small party for almost a year after the disappearance took place. William Gerling of Phoenix had given up the search today for his son, Bruce, 21, who became lost in the Rocky Mountain National Park. The elder Gerling has searched the park almost continually since the two youths became separated from a hiking party. Like those before him in the initial search, William never found anything, and as mentioned, Bruce and David have never been found. In early 1983, 27-year-old Rudy Moder had made plans to visit the Rocky Mountains National Park, and these plans would be realised in mid-February that year. However, they wouldn't be realised without an issue. On the 13th of February 1983, Rudy set off from the Zimmerman Lake trailhead of Colorado Highway 14 near Cameron Pass. The plan was supposed to be a 2 or 3 night solo skiing and mountaineering trip over Thunder Pass and down into the Ditch Camp 3 area. According to friends, Rudy was planning to take day trips from a base camp he planned to establish in the area. Rudy was last seen by friends in the Zimmerman Lake area around 9 AM on February 13, and he headed on up while his friends headed back to the trailhead. Rudy was described as an experienced winter mountaineer with 2 years experience in the German Army Mountain Corps and 2 Himalayan expeditions, very fit and a strong ski mountaineer. 6 days later, on the 19th of February, Rudy would be reported missing to the Larimer County Sheriff's Office by his roommate, Hans Musmüller. Hans told the sheriff that Rudy should have been back by now and was well overdue. The sheriff agreed, and an initial investigation by law enforcement led to a greater search by the following day. Many search teams had been activated and boots were now on the ground. A food cache belonging to Moder was found at the mouth of Box Canyon. On February 21, a snow cave was found about 15 metres from the food cache. Only a very small hole was evident due to a heavy snowfall of 30 centimetres on February 19. These were the only positive clues found during the intensive 4-day search. Just to clarify, there were no further signs of Rudy in or around the snow cave or at the site of the food cache. The Colorado Springs Gazette states this: 65 people, an avalanche dog, and 4 helicopters aided in Tuesday's search for Rudy. Searchers said they found no new clues to help locate murder. What was particularly interesting about this disappearance was that the search teams were in fact hopeful and expectant in finding tracks or clues as to where he might have gone. However, you could argue that it appears when Rudy left, the weather wasn't all that bad. In the days following his disappearance though, there seems to have been heavy snowfall, so even if there were footprints present at one stage, they would have been thoroughly covered. Believing that Rudy must have been under the snow somewhere, the stated avalanche dog was brought in alongside other canines too, but they never found any indication of his presence. They couldn't lock onto a scent or anything like that. It's also important to take note of Rudy's expertise. He knew of the dangers better than most of us ever will, and he had great experience in this kind of environment. And to leave no trace behind at all is troubling. Almost 40 years have passed since this disappearance, and no trace of Rudy has ever been found, which is curious. The items of clothing and his skis should have remained intact, but these items have never been located. For the sake of clarity, I will also note that no signs of a struggle were found anywhere. It didn't appear as though a third party or an animal was involved here. So the question we're left with is what happened to Rudy and where did he go? In September of 2021, Mark O'Neill and Kim Crumbo, 2 veteran ex-park rangers, would disappear in Yellowstone National Park. The pair were half-brothers, very close, and given their expertise and background, they loved spending time in these kinds of wilderness areas. At this point in their lives, Mark was 67 and Kim was 74 years old, so while getting on in their lives, the two of them were highly experienced. The first time I came across their disappearance was from the Salt Lake Tribune, who reported this on the 21st of September 2021. A search and rescue operation is underway in Yellowstone National Park for Mark and Kim. Relatives reported the pair missing after they were overdue from a backcountry trip on Sunday when they didn't return from their expected 4-night excursion. They were reported missing on the 19th, which means that they could have disappeared or met with trouble anywhere from the 15th or 16th onwards. It also appears that part of the search effort was put together on the exact day that they were reported missing and then further expanded thereafter. In the same article, we find that Mark was found on the 20th. Crews found Mark's body Monday along the east shore of Shoshone Lake, the second largest lake in Yellowstone, according to a National Park Service news release. Kim remains missing. Searchers on Sunday first found a vacant campsite on the south side of the lake. The next day, crews found a canoe, a paddle, personal flotation device, and other items along the lake's east shore. Again, the actual date of disappearance is unclear, but at some point during this ordeal, the weather did worsen in the area. Shoshone Lake is prone to high winds, and its average water temperature is a cold 48 degrees Fahrenheit, or 9 degrees Celsius. On Sunday, Yellowstone received its first major snowstorm of the season. Kim himself was highly experienced when it came to bodies of water. For 2 decades of service, his work included being a river ranger and wilderness coordinator at the Grand Canyon National Park, in addition to being a park ranger. As well as that, Kim also worked as a professional river guide for 10 years, and he was a former Navy SEAL too. So if anyone knew the dangers of rivers at a very in-depth level, it was Kim. On that point too, Mark also worked as a river guide, so they both will have been well aware of what they were dealing with. Now, given that the search teams found a canoe, paddle and flotation device along the east shore of the lake, it seems that it wasn't the case that Mark had been passing by and had fallen in. Rather, it seems to suggest that the pair had planted a canoe there, and clearly they had taken some safety measures given that a personal flotation device was found along the shore. Mark's remains were found on the east shore, but the flotation device seems to be listed as being found separately. So that raises the initial question, did he have it on in the first place? Did he remove it? Or did it just come off sometime after? That's not immediately clear. In any case, despite finding Mark, Kim was nowhere to be seen. During the last 5 days, crews have been searching the Shoshone Lake shoreline by boat, swept the trails in the area, and have searched the open waters by helicopter. The National Park Service's Submerged Research Centre says they will begin using sonar equipment to detect clues in the water for Kim. They would never find these clues, and the focus on the lake was intense, in the sense that it was thoroughly searched, repeatedly, but no signs were presenting themselves. During this time, because no trace of Kim could be found at all, the search also encompassed the nearby trails and the surrounding forest areas. This didn't work, no footprints or any kind of clues were ever found. An interesting point is that they couldn't identify a cause of passing for Mark right away. Given that he was found on the east shore of the lake, you might suspect accidental drowning, but this wasn't actually the case. An autopsy has determined that a man whose body was found on the shore of a lake in Yellowstone National Park passed away as a result of hypothermia, park officials said Wednesday. What happened remains under investigation. As said earlier, from what I can gather, it seems to be reported that the equipment were found separately from the body, though the cause of passing itself revealed that the cause wasn't drowning, but rather hypothermia. So does this mean that he was in fact wearing the flotation device? The floating device in question is a life jacket. Could the body easily have slipped out of there? The obvious problem here is that if he wasn't wearing it, you'd expect the cause to be drowning and not hypothermia. Or perhaps the articles just aren't worded the best and he was wearing it, but sure doesn't read that way. In any case, back to the Salt Lake Tribune. Crews continue to look for Kim. Teams are searching near Shoshone Lake on foot and by boat, and with the help of dog teams, a helicopter and sonar. Needless to say, but the dogs never found Kim's scent, and the sonar equipment never revealed Kim's location. While Occam's razor would suggest that perhaps he was in the lake, we have no evidence of this, and the searches, as well as the sonar scans, were coming up negative. It's estimated that in these waters, at these temperatures, a person might only survive for between 20 and 30 minutes after entering. The 20 or 30 minutes there being the time in which the stages of hypothermia would have completely progressed. This raises an interesting point to think about. Kim, for whatever reason, can't have been wearing his flotation device or he'd have been found floating. At least as far as my understanding goes of these devices, that seems inevitably to be the case. However, this never happened, so either he wasn't wearing one, it also came off somehow but was never found, or he wasn't in the lake. After around 3 weeks of searching, the effort was scaled down. The search for Kim has continued for nearly 3 weeks using helicopters, boats, sonar technology and ground crews, park officials said. The park will continue limited search efforts as long as conditions allow this year. That is quite literally the end of the paper trail. Over a year has passed now, and Kim hasn't been found. It seems odd that no trace was found. If he was in the water, you'd have expected his life jacket to be found. Or maybe he wasn't wearing one. That seems unlikely given his background and expertise. However, anything said now is only ever going to be complete speculation. In the end, it seems at this time we don't have a great understanding as to what happened in the lake. This is a disappearance that I'll keep checking back in on, so if there's ever any updates, I'll share it. Now, let's explore the next disappearance. Daniel Robinson was 24 years old when he disappeared on the 23rd of June 2021. Daniel was very much a keen outdoorsman and loved spending time in the fresh air. He was also very close to his family too and always maintained constant contact with them. At the time of his disappearance, he was a hydrogeologist and had found work at a remote drill site in the Arizona desert. This location was near Buckeye, not far from Sun Valley Parkway and Cactus Road. Daniel was working with a pump technician called Ken Elliott, and they were together that morning between 9:15 and 9:30 am. This is important because it wasn't Daniel's first job of the day, it was his second, implying that he must have been going for quite some time at this point and must have been up very early. This was Ken's first time working with Daniel, and the two hadn't met before, but they were tasked with working on a deep well project in the area so that water could be easily accessed. Something odd took place early on that day, and Ken would recall that Daniel became distracted. He was just looking off into the desert. He had a very, very distant look in his eyes. Whenever he'd turn around again, I would look at him and look into his eyes. The first thing I thought was maybe it was some kind of substance he'd taken or something, though his pupils were not dilated. From that standpoint, everything appeared to be normal. Then I thought this was a medical condition or something. I wasn't too sure. I kept watching him, but he just kept turning around and looking off into the desert. Then he just turned around and walked back over to his Jeep, and I just assumed he was going to get something out of his vehicle. He opened the door, got in, sat down, put on his seatbelt, and then he looked at me and just waved at me, and backed up and took off. So Daniel was obviously displaying odd behaviour at this point, and it's not clear why he kept turning around to look at the desert. Ken obviously thought that this was odd, and straight away thought that Daniel may have either took some kind of substance, or perhaps was having some kind of medical situation. It seems he initially didn't believe it was too serious either way, and after some thought, it also seems he leaned towards medical as opposed to a substance. Odd behaviour right before a disappearance is something that I've covered a number of times at this point, and two that I always think about right off the top of my head are Gaia Pope and Noah Donahue, both of which I've covered before on the channel, so I'll link them separately at the top right and in the description in case you haven't seen them and want to open a new tab. In any case, when Daniel got in the Jeep, he drove off and waved. This is something Ken wasn't expecting, and obviously was taken aback by this, so he immediately called his co-workers and told them what just happened. He said that he didn't really know how to take it, and told them that he thought Daniel was sick and that they might expect a phone call from Daniel explaining that he wasn't well. This phone call would never arrive. In fact, there was no further communication at all. It's not clear precisely what time he was reported missing, but he was reported missing the same day to the Buckeye Police Department. The trigger for this seems to have been that he just simply wasn't heard from at all after he left. In addition to that, when Ken later left work, he saw Daniel's tyre tracks veer off in the wrong direction at a T-junction that would return him to Phoenix. Instead of turning left, he'd gone right, which took him deeper into the Sonoran Desert. The authorities descended on the area, alongside outside search agencies too, and over 70 square miles were scoured by UTVs, cadaver dogs, and air support, including a drone and helicopter. Police did have Daniel's phone provider ping the phone, but it wasn't trackable because it was out of range, they said. The phone provider also revealed that Daniel hadn't used the phone thereafter because there were no further calls or messages sent from the device. This next part is somewhat interesting, so let's get bizarre. On July 21, a rancher found the Jeep rolled over and on its side in a ravine on his property. The airbags in the vehicle were deployed, and officials said evidence shows Daniel was wearing his seatbelt at the time of the crash. Daniel's father said, "Initially, I was scared when I first got the call. We have the vehicle, but we don't have my son." Daniel's father, David, hired accident reconstructionist and private investigator Jeff McGrath to piece together how Daniel's Jeep ended up in the ravine. Immediately when I saw the vehicle, I noticed something wasn't right with it. The damage didn't match with the terrain and where it was laying, said McGrath. McGrath downloaded the vehicle's information from the airbag control module and found the Jeep was started more than 40 times after the airbags were deployed. After the airbags came out, somebody turned that ignition over at least 46 more times. That's not normal, we usually see 1 or 2 because it adds when we download the box. Interestingly, this module also tracks the vehicle's speed after the airbags are deployed. McGrath found that there were an additional 11 miles on the car after the airbags were deployed, meaning, obviously, that after the Jeep had crashed, it was driven again. Inside the vehicle, authorities found Daniel's phone, wallet, keys and clothing. It's unclear what they meant by clothing. I'm not sure if he had undressed or if it was a change of clothing that they'd found. A couple of details make this discovery somewhat curious. The area that the Jeep was found had been searched initially, but it either wasn't there or it was missed. The authorities said that because of the rough terrain, the vehicle wasn't clearly visible to crews searching by air and foot. It can't really be ascertained now if they'd missed it or if it just wasn't there, but that was the direct quote from the spokesperson. Second to that is the fact that the rancher who discovered the Jeep had said that he thought that it had only been there for a short while before he came across it. He said it was clean and that his cows would have found it. Cows are inquisitive creatures and would have licked it. That comment by the rancher seems to suggest that the vehicle may not have been there during the initial search. But again, it looks like we're not going to know for sure now. Just to be clear too, Daniel disappeared on the 24th of June and his Jeep was found by the rancher almost a whole month later on the 21st of July. Going back to the investigation, while the authorities were suggesting that foul play didn't seem to have occurred here, McGrath noted a couple of interesting points. McGrath says the system shows that the Jeep was involved in a collision around 1 PM, nearly 4 hours after he was last seen. We have a gap in time and we don't know where he went and what was going on. The activity with the vehicle is very suspicious, and any time we get a download that doesn't match, by looking at the photographs it doesn't match the area, sometimes those could be a staged event, and that looked like a staged event to me. Those were some powerful words by Jeff, because what he is essentially saying is that something doesn't add up here, and perhaps a strong possibility exists that the car was placed there after the fact by Jeff himself or a third party. I'm not sure what else he could have meant there. There were some thoughts flying around the investigation questioning Daniel's mental health and that there may have been a couple of problems there. It seems that these ideas had come about given his behaviour that morning, and friends had said that he wasn't quite himself in the time leading up to the disappearance. It was also later found that he had recently been rejected by a girl. It looks like he became attached too quickly to her, and she didn't like that. He also seems to have turned up at her house unannounced, which she didn't like. If he was suffering at that time, I imagine that situation didn't help much. But his family have contested this line of thought about mental health problems, stating that Daniel wouldn't just up and leave without telling the family, and that it was completely out of character to do so. That aside, and as you can probably imagine, given the discovery of the Jeep, the search area was well defined at this stage, and the search effort was localised to that point. Around a week after this, a skull was found to the south of where the Jeep had been located, but it was found that it didn't belong to Daniel. I've just had to come back and edit this in, because I've had another look and it appears that Daniel did undress in the Jeep. They found a t-shirt and jeans that were turned inside out, shorts, his orange work vest, boots and 2 socks. Again, it's not clear if Daniel changed clothing in the car or if he had literally undressed just about everything. I also wanted to edit in that I found another unusual quote by Jeff. One of the leading hypotheses at this point was that Daniel had simply become delirious, taken off his clothing and walked off into the desert. However, obviously, to this date, Daniel hasn't been found, which by now might have been expected if this was the case. In relation to this, Jeff added, "If you were delirious and ripped off all your clothing and wandered out into the desert, you wouldn't stick one of your shoes under the car. My personal theory is that someone deliberately wrecked that vehicle out there. The question becomes, who did that, why, and under what circumstances did that occur? Meaning that if Jeff had gone the wrong way at the junction and had gone deeper into the desert, would you have expected to come into contact with a third party out there? It seems unlikely at first glance, but of course I don't know that. In the end, and at this time, it appears as though no one really knows what happened to Daniel, or even why he ended up out there. Or actually, if he or his body is still out there." Now, let's move to another country. In Australia, there's a mountain known as the Black Mountain, and perhaps fittingly located in the Black Mountain National Park. It's said that the local Aboriginal tribes shun the area and describe it as a place that people shouldn't venture. They called the mountain Kalkajaka, or the place of the spear, and it looks like they did this because they associated the mountain with very negative occurrences and outcomes for some of the people who travelled to this place, namely not returning. You can find some of the beliefs of the Aboriginals who basically state that they believe that not so well intentioned spirits live inside the rocks and the boulders of the mountain. What's particularly interesting here too is that European colonists also seem to have added to the natives' folklore with odd reported occurrences of their own. While researching about the mountain, similar to the native folklore, the European colonists spoke of many of their horses and cows straying into the mountain area, only to never be able to locate them again. It's also been said that some of these trips to find the animals didn't end well either, and some of the people looking also never came back. Now thankfully, and touch wood and all that, I haven't come across any recent disappearances on the mountain, but there does seem to be quite a lot of disappearances that have been reported on in the past, among other general weirdness. The first incident I could find that received press attention was the disappearance of an old miner called Jimmy Wren, and this was in May of 1892. Jimmy ascended the Black Mountain to look for gold, but this particular trip seems to have been different from the others, and something must have gone awry because he never came back down. He'd been staying in the Joyce Hotel in Cocktown with a friend of his, and they were on business there. Later, they found themselves in a wayside tavern at Trevethan Creek, and they rested there a while. Jimmy was ready to move on, but his friend had been drinking, and they agreed to split up and meet at a hotel called Helen Vale. As you might imagine, when Jimmy's friend eventually made it to Helen Vale, Jimmy was nowhere to be seen. So somewhere in this vast land of rocks and boulders, Jimmy disappeared. Inspector Fitzgerald was the person who led the search effort for James, and he told the police commissioner that their search had ended in absolute failure. James had disappeared not far from the Annan River, and Fitzgerald had people searching all over the mountain and up and down the river. Unfortunately, when they couldn't find a trace of him, no directional indicators, no clothes or equipment or anything of that nature, Fitzgerald started to believe that James's disappearance was intentional, presumably because he felt that they should have found something. He then told the commissioner that he considered further searches useless. The friend, among others in the area, disagreed with this assessment, and from what I can gather, Jimmy was very well thought of, and none of them believed that this was intentional. However, they couldn't come up with any theories that made more sense. There's an odd quote from an article on this, written back in February of 1933. This is by the Brisbane Courier. The cry was raised. Settlers, farmers, packers, miners, they all came from all over the district. And the natives joined the search, which was kept up for 3 weeks. It was a local sensation, a mystery that all were determined to solve. But Jimmy Wren had vanished completely. Between Trevethan and Helen Vale, only a few miles, he had disappeared, leaving no sign to guide the keenest trackers on Earth, the Aborigines. It does seem as though people were shocked and taken aback by this. It looks like they were surprised that the Aboriginal trackers couldn't find a single track or trace of him. And despite almost 130 years passing since then now, Jimmy, not any sign of him has ever been found or recovered. Now, I came across an article by Australia's ABC News which briefly spoke about some other historic disappearances on the Black Mountain. Here are a few that they briefly highlighted. In circa 1800, notorious criminal Sugarfoot Jack and his accomplices flee to Black Mountain following an exchange of projectiles. They were never seen again, despite an exhaustive search. July 1872, a courier named Philip Grainer goes out looking for his stray calf. He, his horse, and the calf never return. November 1882, two cattlemen, Harry Owens and George Hawkins, disappear while looking for stray cattle around Black Mountain, as does one of the police trackers searching for the missing men. A second tracker returns completely unhinged and unable to provide a coherent report. 1890, Constable Ryan tracks a fugitive to a cave at Black Mountain. He enters to see if the fugitive might be hiding inside. According to those present, he never came back out. I came across an article by the Sunday Mail wrote in January of 1934, which reported a couple of these incidents in more detail. Early one Sunday morning in November 1882, Harold Owens, a well-known and popular settler of the Oakey Creek district, several miles west of Cooktown, left his farm on horseback to search the Black Mountain country for some horses he had lost. A few hours later, he was seen heading for the mountain by a carrier who was travelling along the Palmer River Road, and that was the last that was ever seen or heard of Owens and his horse. In this case, the police and Aborigine trackers, assisted by hundreds of friends of the Owens family, made an exhaustive search of the mountain and a vast area of country in the vicinity, but again, no trace of the missing man was found. Owens and his horse had completely vanished. The search parties had just given up the search when yet another man was reported to have disappeared at the mountain. This was George Hawkins, a well-known person of the 4 Mile district outside Cooktown. This is important because the ABC article made it sound like Harold and George disappeared together, but there was about a month in between the two disappearances. Quite literally, the search for Harold had just ended when George also disappeared and the searchers were once again out and looking. Continuing on, George had a club foot, and one fine morning in December 1882 he left the 4 Mile district and rode towards the Black Mountain in order to ascertain whether there was any feed for cattle in the locality. He had been talking about taking up some land in the vicinity. Hawkins, of course, knew all about the mysterious disappearances, but he took little notice of them and declared that the men must have got lost somewhere, which was hardly feasible since both of the missing men were experienced bushmen. At any rate, Hawkins proceeded along the Palmer River Road where he met several travellers. He spoke to one of these near the mountain and mentioned that he was visiting the country around the strange hill. As the traveller continued on his way, he looked back and saw Hawkins leave the road and ride in the direction of the mountain, and that was the last that was ever seen or heard of Hawkins or his horse. These two disappearances, and the fact that absolutely nothing was turning up at all, created a local sensation, in that everyone in the area was absolutely determined to figure out what had happened. After George went missing, even more people turned up to search. Harold nor George has ever been found, nor any bones or anything like that. The Aboriginal trackers had said in both instances that there was no evidence of foul play or animal predation, which brings us to an interesting quote. The official verdict in both cases was disappeared at Black Mountain, but the natives' verdict was that they were eaten up altogether by Debble. Unsurprisingly, I suppose, I've never actually heard of that term before, but according to Oxford Languages, it's an evil spirit in Aboriginal belief. If you've seen my video on the hidden people, there'll be a link to this in the top right now. This might sound oddly familiar. They would then gather them all up and take them home. Children cook the bardees when they get home. After 4 o'clock, they must not go chasing the bardees, they wouldn't be allowed. They reckon these Debble will take them away. That is a little bullshit, man. As soon as the sun goes down, he starts edging them off and taking them away. I have no idea what bardees are. Noongar, though, refers to a person of southwest of Western Australia, or rather, the name of the original inhabitants of the southwest of Western Australia, and from what I can gather, are the largest Aboriginal culture block in Australia. If you're from Australia and you know more about that, then I'd welcome you to correct me in the comments. It's so weird that all over the world, these cultures used to talk about little people that would make people disappear. I didn't even mean to find that, by the way. I had no idea that the natives talked about this, or I'd have included it in the Hidden People video. In any case, just out of curiosity and briefly, this is how the natives describe the Bullyids. He's a little hairy man, about 2 feet high. He's a devil. He will take the children. They must not go out after dark, after 4 PM. Right, in any case, let's stop getting sidetracked and have a more in-depth look at what happened to Philip Grainer. At this time, one of the best known carriers engaged on the Cooktown-Palmer River route was a man named Philip Grainer. One evening, during July of 1872, he was on his way to the Palmer River with a pack horse team loaded with provisions. He camped with some other carriers near the Black Mountain. That night, however, 3 of his horses broke loose and galloped away in the direction of the mountain. At daybreak the next morning, Grainer mounted another horse and set out to search for the missing animals. He made straight for the mountain and was never seen again. When Grainer had not returned to the camp after 3 hours, the other carriers who were preparing to resume their respective journeys became alarmed. 3 of them rode towards the mountain shouting Philip's name. There was no response to their calls, however. They had barely reached the foot of the grim pile of granite slabs when they saw Grainer's saddled horse grazing contentedly nearby. The article then goes on to explain that there was no sign of Philip at all, and despite a thorough search, he was never found. The following day, a large police presence and Aboriginal trackers descended on the mountain to search for Philip, but they too couldn't find a trace of him. It's said that one of the Aboriginal trackers had said it's as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. It looks like it wasn't only the mountain that was scoured, but miles and miles around the area too. Again, the natives started talking about how this was the work of the Devil. I was hoping to find some information from the natives themselves, specifically just what they had to say about the mountain. ABC had spoken to one of the indigenous peoples there called Mary Shipton. This is what she had to say. As a small child, Mary was taught to respect the site and gets angry when tourists enter without permission or guidance. It's hard to tell them. They want to discover the country, but they don't know what's really there. A lot of people don't respect our culture. We see a lot of non-indigenous people. They think they know about sacred sites, but they should show respect to indigenous people by not walking on their country. For me, it's a sacred site and no one is allowed to go to that area. If they do, they will get very, very sick. I feel bad about it. They're heading straight into bad vibes there. So it's clear to see that the native peoples there ascribe disappearances and other negative events on the mountain to the more unusual side of things. ABC also spoke to another man there called Harold Ludwig, who I believe is indigenous too. He said, "In our Boros, spirits appear to us. It's not just a fairy tale, it's real. You see these things come to you." It's quite difficult to find specific information about this mountain. For example, what I was really interested in knowing was just how many people visit the national park annually. I thought this might be interesting because I can't for the life of me find any recent disappearances in the area, or anything like that, which is a good thing in all fairness. I can only seem to find these incidents that took place around and well over 100 years ago now. What I did come to realise though, is that Australia's Black Mountain isn't the only mountain with that name that is also associated with disappearances. This next disappearance was reported on the 30th of November 1908 and occurred on the Black Mountain, only not in Australia, but rather in Virginia in the United States. And with a title like that, who isn't interested in hearing more? Within less than half a century, many persons have been swallowed up in the deep ravines of the Black Mountain in Wise County, Virginia, never to be found again. The old mountain carries many strange secrets, says the New York Times. Many have ridden into its shadows only for the eternal gates of silence closing noiselessly behind them. The region is inhabited by mountain people who are a law unto themselves. Few men have ever ventured alone into the mountain and come back to tell the tale. No explanation has ever been given as to what became of those who disappeared, nor how the manner in which those whose bodies have been recovered managed to pass away. The Seymour Daily Republican then makes the point that the general public at the time weren't really aware of the disappearances that were happening until a guy named Edward Leisenring Wentz disappeared in the area. Edward was a young millionaire from Philadelphia, and while it's not clear what he was doing that day, we know that he disappeared on the 14th of October 1904. That morning, he took his favourite horse and travelled to the Black Mountain area, and this would be the last time that he would ever be seen, as he never returned that evening, and this prompted a search. The search did actually find Edward's horse pretty quickly, and that was on the same evening. His horse was found abandoned with the bridle and the saddle still on near the Powell's River, not far from the Roaring Fork, which apparently is the spot where several other missing men disappeared from. For weeks, hundreds of men scoured the mountains, hunting through every ravine and in every cave for some trace of the lost man. The impression gained credence that Wentz had been taken supposedly for the purpose of ransom. This led to the offering of a reward of $55,000 for his return. Stimulated by the offer of the reward, hundreds of bold men joined in the search. This supposed ransom demand never actually materialised, and people quickly began to realise that something else must have happened here. And the search continued for quite some time because of the promise of a reward. Exactly 5 months after the official search for Edward reached its inconclusive conclusion, his body was actually found by a mountaineer who happened by it. He said that it was an odd sight and that Wentz was lying peacefully in a lonely spot among fallen trees. Edward's body, unfortunately, was in a state of decay, and it was impossible to determine a cause of passing, but no obvious injuries or anything like that was ever reported. We might have had more luck with today's tech, but back then, from what I understand, it was much more difficult to determine a diagnosis when in this context of decay. Locals wanted answers as to what had happened here, but unfortunately all they were left with was speculation. Some believed that this was intentional and that Edward purposely went up there to be at peace. Others made the argument that he wouldn't have just abandoned his favourite horse, which he seemed to be very fond of, and left it with its saddle still on. In the end though, it's not actually clear what happened to Edward, or how the initial massive search managed to miss him. The Seymour Daily Republican ended with this: "The daily papers carried columns of well-written theories attempting to explain in some plausible manner the means and the cause of the passing of Wentz. But the secret lay hidden in the recesses of the rocky hills, and there were none so bold to go and look for it." It was then realised that over half a dozen men had disappeared in the same area as Edward over the course of the years, but only Edward's body had been discovered. The Seymour Daily Republican explains, "All of the supposed victims of the mountains had ventured into the wild region where the mad waters of Roaring Creek leap and pitch down the rugged mountain ravine over shagged rocks to pour into the more quiet stream known as Powell's River. After the discovery of Edward's body, people began talking about a man who disappeared under unusual circumstances before him, James B. Gearhart. James was a Bristol insurance man who ventured out to the mountains, only to never return," the article explains. The disappearance of Gearhart is as much a mystery now as when the searchers were peering fearfully into the ravines searching for him. He left at his lodging quarters in Bristol a valuable library, a wardrobe full of valuable clothing and other personal property. These effects have remained unclaimed to this day. James was apparently staying at a hotel in Appalachia on business. It seems he was inspecting the mining areas of the region. One morning he set off to the Black Mountain and took the route which led the way of Roaring Fork and near Powell's River, which happened to be the place where the others are thought to have disappeared. That was the last ever seen of Gearhart. Inquiry has been made in every part of the country, but no trace has ever been found of the missing man. Now you can probably guess what I'm about to say, but all of the searches for James ended in failure and no conclusions have ever been drawn as to what happened to him or the other men in the area. Years after these prior incidents, the former congressman James B. Richmond of Gate City relayed an interesting event that happened to him at the Black Mountain that held a parallel to Wentz and Gearhart. The occurrence in question took place just prior to the Civil War. Two men were searching for a herd of lost cattle in the wilds of the mountain region. When they came to the fatal spot near the mouth of Roaring Fork, they dismounted and hitched their horses in order to reach points that were inaccessible while mounted. They separated at the gorge, taking separate ridges in the ascent, having agreed to return and meet at the mouth of the gorge within a specified time. Only one of these men ever followed the backwards trail. He waited in vain and called repeatedly for his companion. Finally, As the shades of night began to fall, he mounted and rode away from the lonely spot alone. Search was made for the missing man immediately thereafter. From that day to this, and in the meantime, many other men have walked out of the world of men through the same rocky gorge. No trace of him has ever been discovered. Another incident was relayed too, in which the authorities had gotten wind of moonshiners somewhere in the area, and a group of revenue officers went to seek them out. They eventually decided to search the Black Mountain specifically, but all of them vanished there and not a single one returned. The authorities weren't sure what had happened and started an investigation into the incident. Some locals believed that the moonshiners got them, and others believed that there were sinister forces at work, and then they cited the previous incidents and history of the mountain. The federal government themselves took an interest in this and poured some resources into the search, and they expanded the available manpower. However, and as quoted from the article, the mountain remained silent. The searchers never found anything to give any kind of clue as to what might have happened to the officers. There were some that reasoned that they didn't believe that the moonshiners would have done this, even if they were operating in the area, because doing this has now attracted massive attention and, put a target on the back. What is interesting is that the dogs never found a scent either, which I suppose could indicate that the officers might have been moved off the mountain or to another area entirely, just buried somewhere far away from the actual search radius. Unfortunately, a time frame wasn't given here, but afterwards a young mining engineer called Walter Kemp and Thomas Kilgore, who was the superintendent of the miners, disappeared on the Black Mountain. The locals used to say that they were immune to the mountain's evils because they would traverse it quite a lot. Well, that apparently wasn't the case, because when they made this journey together up the Roaring Fork one day, they both disappeared and they never made it to their destination. The story becomes quite familiar now, in that again, search parties were dispatched to the area once more, but like all the other incidents, they never found a hint of anything. No bodies were ever recovered, no clothes, no equipment, just no trace at all was found. And I'm sure you can imagine the rumours and superstitions that this was then brewing in the local communities. Right, just thematically at this point, I came across another Black Mountain, though this time much closer to me in the UK. Now, I'm from the north of England, but there is one in Wales, and I came across an interesting article that highlights an incident in which a person went missing, but thankfully was found. I thought that this would be an interesting one to go through because it can act as a reminder of just how careful and prepared you've got to be, because Mother Nature sometimes just has it in store for people. This incident happened in March of this year and was reported by the South Wales Guardian on the 5th of March. The woman who this happened to wanted to remain anonymous, but we know that she was around 50 years old. She's considered an experienced hiker who's very familiar with the Black Mountain and the surrounding areas too. She likes to take a dog for walks there, and this time was no different, except it was, and basically everything that could go wrong did in fact go wrong. What was supposed to be a quick dog walk turned into a bit of a nightmare on the Black Mountain. This person normally carries a bag with her that holds various supplies that are useful for longer hikes, so she has a power bank, food and water, things like this. This time though, thinking she was only going to be there for a short while, she didn't take those things with her, so she parked in a familiar place and began hiking the route that she's covered countless times. Now, as she was ascending, a torrent of awful weather came her way, with powerful winds and heavy rain. This is what she said. I tried to turn back to the car, but the wind physically knocked me over. This happened a few times and totally disoriented me. Then the rain started and it was hitting my face like heavy projectiles. I was trying to get back to the car, but I just couldn't find it. After a while, we hit a boggy area which I knew from previous walks was nowhere near the car. That's when I realised we weren't going to get back. At this point, just after entering the boggy area, she was surrounded by a thick fog, and by 6 PM that day, she couldn't see any more than a few metres around her. She then called for help, and I don't think I've ever mentioned this app before on the channel, but it can be a great survival tool if there's phone service in the area. It's called What 3 Words, and I have this app myself. Just for those that don't know, what this app does is that it gives every 3 square metres of the world a combination of 3 unique words. The idea is that you open the app and then you see your 3 words and then you tell the authorities your location based off the words. This app is great because what tends to happen when people call the emergency services is that they can't adequately describe where they are. So the emergency services are left with this problem where they're guessing where you might be, and obviously this then wastes time and could potentially make the situation more dangerous for the person in trouble and for the people trying to find them. Of course, the app does have its limitations. You know, if there isn't a signal in the area, then it's not going to be any help. Though I suppose it will register the location up until the point that there was no signal, so it could still help rescuers land closer to you. Though of course, I know that there might be privacy issues for some, and they might not like that I suppose it literally tracks your location, but it might be a good idea to just, every time you're going out, to download it, and then maybe uninstall it when you're done in the wilderness area, or something like that. But I leave that to you. I'm sure you know what's better for you than I do. In any case, that situation is exactly what happened to our protagonist here, and unfortunately at some point during this, let's call it unsuccessful hike, she lost a phone signal. And so her 3 words no longer corresponded to her actual location, sending rescuers in the wrong direction. Here's how she described the ordeal. I was hunkered down in a hole to protect myself from the elements. I got up every few minutes so I didn't get hypothermia and shouted hello in case anyone was around. I couldn't see a thing. Everything below was pitch black and above from thick fog. I phoned 999 again to tell them I was still where I'd said I was. They sent a link to find my GPS location, but my phone just wouldn't load it. I checked the What 3 Words app again and realised I was in a completely different place to where they thought I was. Then the phone cut. After the call cut out, she received another call from Mountain Rescue, and then her phone died. Realising this wasn't a good situation to be in, she tried moving out into a more open area to be more visible, but the visibility was so poor that she gave it up. She had unfortunately fallen over a few times now while wandering around, that she ended up on her back on the grass, and she thought that that was just going to be the end of it right there and then. She said that she kept hearing odd noises that she wasn't familiar with, and then she saw lights in the distance. I grabbed the dog and just started running towards it. By that point I was screaming and shouting, and suddenly there were more lights. One of their torches had caught a flash from the dog's eyes, otherwise they wouldn't have seen me. Thankfully, her and her dog made it out safely, but it does just go to show how careful you've got to be. This is an area that she was completely familiar with, and yet it all went bad wrong still, you know. She did have a little reflection on the incident, and she said, "The whole time I was thinking, why didn't I bring my bag? It's the biggest mistake I've ever made. I was like one of those idiots I shout at on the news for climbing in their flip-flops. It will never ever happen again, and I forever will be grateful to the police and volunteers who put their lives at risk to save mine. If anyone takes anything from my story, please let it be that they won't make the same mistake I did." I'm just thankful that she made it out of that situation relatively unscathed, and with an important lesson learned too. I think we'll end this one here with that piece of sound advice from this lady, and I'll hand it over to you in the comments. I'd just like to take a moment to thank you for watching, and a special thank you to all of the patrons as well for all of your support. I appreciate it very much. If you found the video interesting, then please do hit the like button, and if not, then feel free to give it a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. With all of that said, I hope that you've had a great day or evening depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys. Peace.